Philosophy 2, DE, Lecture 4 on Kantian Ethics, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Section 2, the principle of humanity. Another formulation of the categorical imperative, the principle of humanity. If all of this discussion of contradictions, freedom, perfect and imperfect duties sounds horribly abstract, difficult to apply, and difficult to comprehend, then you are not alone. Scholars, since the time of Kant, have often found his ideas incredibly suggestive, powerful, and important, but also difficult to fully grasp and apply. Kant is aware of these difficulties, and he gives another formulation of the categorical imperative that is famous for being easier to understand and comprehend. The principle reads thus: always act so as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in another, always as an end in itself, and never merely as a means. The groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Section 2. Defining ends and means in ordinary language. We often hear people say, the ends justifies the means. When people say this, they usually mean that some end or goal justifies some means or the way of getting to that goal. The end, in this case, is not the same as the consequence, the way the utilitarian or consequentialist would use that term. The end is the goal or purpose. Kant never says that the ends justifies the means. Instead, he says to, quote, always act so as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in another, always as an end in itself, and never merely as a means. How should we understand the meaning of Kant's statement that we should always, quote, act so as to treat the humanity, whether in yourself or in another, always as an end in itself, and not merely as a means? Let's focus first on treating someone as a means versus treating someone as an end in themselves. If I treat someone as an end in themselves, that means that the person and their humanity are both a goal of my action. That person and their humanity are my reason for acting and part of my purpose for acting. By contrast, if I treat someone as a means only, then that person and their humanity are just the way of getting to my own goal. In everyday language, we often say that we, quote, use people, or we were, quote, used by people. Kant is encouraging us not to simply use people for our own goals and needs, but to consider their humanity in our actions. The humanity of others should be part of the reason and motivation for my actions which involve others. If I treat the humanity of others as an end in itself and not as a means, then that will mean that they are part of my goal and not just a tool I am using to reach my own selfish goals. But what does it mean to treat their humanity as an end in itself and not merely as a means? Kant's notion of humanity is that element in us which makes us uniquely human. In particular for Kant, my humanity implies that I am a self-governing creature, that is, I make my own choices. I am also a rational creature, capable of thinking about my choices and reasoning towards the best action. Kant also believes that all rational creatures will have their own preservation, happiness, needs, and individual projects that are important parts of their lives. When you put all of this together, to treat the humanity of others as an end in itself and not merely as a means, implies that I treat others as rational, self-governing creatures with their own hopes, needs, concerns, and search for happiness, and further, that promoting and preserving that humanity should be an important part of why I act and why I interact with the people I encounter. It is important to point out that Kant does not claim here that I can never use other people as a means to my own end. What he is saying is that I cannot treat them as nothing but a means to my own end. In other words, it is okay to think about what I need from others and to act in such a way that I expect to benefit from others. When it becomes immoral is when I start to see another person as nothing but a way to get what I want, and I ignore their own humanity. When I walk into a store to buy groceries, it is morally acceptable from Kant's point of view for me to expect that a person in the store is going to help me with my goal of making a successful and useful purchase. It becomes immoral if I treat that person in such a way that I deny their humanity and they become nothing but a way for me to get my groceries. I can interact with people with the purpose of meeting my own needs, but they must still always be more to me than a tool to meet those needs. Lying to get a loan as an example of violating the humanity of others and treating them as a means only. We have said that for Kant, to treat the humanity of others as an end in itself and not merely as a means implies that I treat others as rational self-governing creatures with their own hopes, needs, and concerns. One example that Kant gives of violating this principle is making a lying promise. If I were to lie to someone, for example, telling them that I will repay money that I want to borrow from them, even though I actually have no intention of paying them back, then Kant would claim that I am violating this principle. It is easy to see how I am doing this on at least two levels. First of all, I am not treating the person as a rational creature capable of making their own choices and decisions. In fact, by telling a lie, I have made it impossible for the other person to make a rational choice about loaning me the money, because I haven't given them the relevant information from which to make a rational choice. Secondly, I am using them in a more obvious sense. That person loaning me the money is nothing but a tool for me to get what I want, the money, and I am not considering their own hopes, needs, and concerns. They will be affected by loaning me the money that I will not repay, and their ability to meet their own hopes, needs, and concerns will be affected. By ignoring that, I am ignoring their humanity in this way as well. Treating the humanity in myself as an end in itself, and not merely as a means. So far, we have only discussed one half of Kant's rule. Kant says to treat the humanity in myself and in others as an end in itself and not merely as a means. So what would it look like if I treated the humanity in myself as an end and not merely as a means? It would mean that I also treat myself as a rational, self-governing creature with my own hopes, needs, concerns, and desire for happiness. The example which Kant gives of violating this principle is the person who commits suicide or otherwise harms themselves. On Kant's view, the person who kills themselves or otherwise harms themselves is treating themselves as a mere thing and negates the very possibility of pursuing their own rational development, happiness, and needs. If suicide is treating myself merely as a means, it is morally impermissible on Kant's view. Even short of suicide, Kant says that just intentionally hurting myself is an example of ignoring my own needs and my own search for contentment and happiness, and is therefore wrong. Perfect and imperfect duties. We remember the case of perfect and imperfect duties from our discussion of Kant's other version of the categorical imperative, the formula of the universal law, where he required us to act as if the maxim of our action would become a universal law. There we saw that maxims which generated logical contradictions should never be followed, but when a maxim generated a contradiction of the will, I could choose sometimes, but not always, to follow that maxim. Kant makes a similar distinction here. If my action is one that ignores, violates, or detracts from the humanity of another person by actively treating them as merely a non-rational thing, as I would if I told them a lie, then I should never treat people in that way. So in this case I have a perfect duty not to act in a way that actively violates, works against, or ignores someone else's humanity or my own. But Kant also says that I have an imperfect duty to sometimes actively promote, aid, and support the humanity of others. Kant sometimes refers to these duties as meritorious or contingent duties. Lying, cheating, stealing, and self-harm all actively ignore or violate the humanity of others or myself, so I can never do these things according to Kant. On the other hand, failing to develop my talents or not helping my neighbor do not, on Kant's view, actively violate their humanity, but because they are ways to actively promote the humanity in myself and in others, I should at least sometimes act in these ways. I am not required to do so every time, but I should do so at least some of the time. Hopefully you remember that these are the same kinds of things which caused contradictions of the will, but not logical contradictions, when I asked about the morality by universalizing my maxim and checking for contradictions. Let's lay this relationship out one more time explicitly, showing the following comparisons. The next two slides will be packed full of information, so you may want to stop the lecture and read through them carefully to see if they make sense to you. These slides and the ideas behind them are complex, but together, the next two slides bring together the central ideas of this lecture and the previous lecture to show how they are related. Remember that the formula of humanity discussed throughout this lecture and the formula of the law of nature discussed throughout our last lecture are both forms of the categorical imperative, according to Kant. These last two slides show how the two formulas fit together. Perfect duties. Perfect duties must never be violated. Logically, when using the form of the categorical imperative, which focuses on universal laws, perfect duties create logical contradictions if I universalize the maxim behind that action. As an example, a false promise to repay a loan contradicts itself if everyone follows that rule, so I should never act on that rule. Relative to the principle of humanity, our second version of the categorical imperative, as discussed in this lecture, I fail in a perfect duty when I actively violate or ignore the humanity in myself or others. Using the same example, when I make a false promise to repay a loan, I treat the person from whom I get the loan as merely a tool, as someone without their own hopes, needs, and self-governing rationality. Therefore, I should never make these kinds of false promises. Imperfect duties. Imperfect duties are duties created that I can sometimes ignore, but I must also sometimes actively support. From the point of view of the categorical imperative, when thought of from the principle of logical contradictions, no logical contradictions are created when I universalize my maxim. But universalizing my maxim does create a contradiction of the will. As an example, the principle of not helping others does not create a logical contradiction. When we universalize this rule so that no one helps others if they have other things to do, this does not create a logical contradiction, and we can live in a world that follows this principle. However, we saw that this principle does create a contradiction of the will, because ultimately I will want the help of others. For this reason, I must not always follow this principle, and I must at least at some point help others. When considered relative to the principle of humanity, imperfect duties come from the type of actions which actively support and nurture the humanity in others, but where ignoring these principles does not actively violate the humanity of others. As an example, not volunteering to help others does not actively violate or ignore their humanity, but deciding to help others would actively promote their needs, interests, and humanity. In conclusion, I should help others at least some of the time, but I don't have to always help others or always help anyone who asks for my assistance. Kant's claim that I should never lie. One of Kant's most controversial claims is the claim that we should never, under any circumstances, lie. Kant even claims that it would be morally wrong to lie to a potential murderer who is looking for a victim in your own house. This example brings about a powerful difference between Kant and the utilitarians. A utilitarian would almost certainly lie to an angry person set on harming another if they thought they could protect them. This is because the utilitarian judges the morality of an action according to the consequences of that action, and almost certainly the consequences would be worse if the person filled with murderous rage is told about the location of their potential victim. Kant, on the other hand, does not judge the morality of actions according to their consequences. As long as I have followed the categorical imperative and treated everyone I interact with respect for their humanity, then I am not morally responsible for the consequences that follow. On Kant's view, it would violate the humanity of the potential murderer if I were to lie to him and treat him as a person who was not capable of making his own rational choices and decisions about his actions. Because I am never permitted to ignore the humanity in others, I am not permitted to lie to the angry man. Of course, if the angry man goes through with his murder, that man is violating the humanity of the person he harms, and so that man will be guilty of violating the moral law. But on Kant's view, the moral guilt would not extend to the person who merely told the truth to the killer. The person telling the truth respected the humanity in everyone he interacted with, and the killer alone is responsible for his inhumane actions.